Hello everyone, this is Con from DailySearch.com. Today I want to be explaining something to webmasters that's commonly misunderstood, and it's something that 99% of customers who actually look at their websites fail to understand. The most important thing for your website's performance is not page speed insights, it's the actual page speed. Now you're going to be saying, well, you're going to neglect page speed insights? No. In fact, I use PageSpeed Insights as probably the most useful tool out there, and I try to implement it as best I can. There are just some complications that arise from doing so. I'm going to break down all the items on PageSpeed for you, and then I'm going to show you why they don't necessarily matter as much as you would think. So, reduce server response time. This can be easily done by serving a static copy of the page, so that way your website is not constantly downloading all the content from your web server. Therefore, it would be faster. Minify CSS is simply just minifying your CSS by removing useless comments and removing white space. Avoid landing page redirects. This means if your website, for instance, in Google is http.example.com, but it redirects to HTTPS, you'll want to go into Google Webmaster Tools and automatically set it to HTTPS as the recommended version to be displayed. That way your users will not be redirected on the landing page, which of course would increase the load time. Minify HTML simply means that you're removing all the extra white space that might be in your HTML. You typically want to do this as best you can. It doesn't improve the load time that much as some of the other useful tools on here, but it's a good thing to have. Enable compression just simply means to enable gzip on text files such as JavaScript, CSS, HTML, those types of files. Enabling gzip for items such as videos, images, and MP3s is actually bad for performance because they already are a compressed format. You're going to be saying, well, you can compress images even more. Very true. But gzip was built for text files and not those types of media formats. So the best thing to do is to avoid gzipping them. And if you use Swift files or other types of formats like Unity and things for an arcade site, then you'll want to avoid gzipping any of those type of media files, as they could actually break them. Minify JavaScript is simply minifying your JavaScript by removing the white space and extra comments that may no longer be needed. Prioritize visible content. Let's read this real quick. The entire HTML response was not sufficient to render the above the fold content. This usually indicates that additional resources loaded after HTML parsing were required to render above the fold content. Now you're going to say, what the hell does that mean? In layman's terms, what it means, you have a gigantic CSS file, or CSS files. Since I use my website, let's just take, even with auto optimize, it says it's got 3 CSS files, and they are not tiny. The best thing you can do in situations like this is you should try and remove unused CSS. For instance, if you're using WooCommerce, write a function in your htaccess to only load WooCommerce on pages that it's needed. That way you won't have to load additional unused resources on your website's homepage or on your post page. For instance, if you're on a post page that has a featured image, why do you care what your forms is going to look like? You don't. It's silly to include it. And there are functions all online that you can learn how to implement that, and I really recommend that everybody should do that. You can also solve this by using Inline and Defer. I've talked about it in Auto Optimize, and it's a complex as hell setting, and you will basically be crying yourself to sleep if your theme is incredibly complex. So the best thing to do is, if you can't get that to work, just remove unused CSS by conditionally loading plugin files only on the pages that they're needed. Leverage browser caching just simply means to enable mod expires and things like that for certain files. If you use Jetpack, chances are you'll see this. You're just going to have to leave it. Nothing you can really do about it. External files you can't really do anything about. Optimize images. Always compress your images by removing metadata and as much useless junk as you can. Image optimizer. I've never seen this thing fail. Always use it and compress everything. Eliminate render blocking JavaScript and CSS. This is actually not that much of a performance issue, but what it actually is it's a rendering issue. What I mean by rendering issue is if you're on a mobile device, you have a low network connection. You have slow internet whether you like it or not. Because let's face it, mobile companies like Verizon, they're cheapskates. They want more money. They're, I wouldn't say subpar, but not really fair pricing. But that's besides the point. What you need to do is the same thing with Inline and Defer. How it works is if you only include the critical CSS, the main CSS path to render the page. So that way, if you have a widget on a more responsive design at the very bottom, like this, why the hell is it loading at the beginning? That's slowing down the rendering time of your website because it's having to grab all that CSS before it can actually paint the styles that are on here. So by using Inline and Defer, you can solve that. Again, if you can't solve that, then the only real option there is to cut down on the total CSS being rendered on the page by conditionally loading heavy things like WooCommerce, BBPress, and BuddyPress. In fact, if anybody can figure out a decent way to do that with BuddyPress, that would be amazing. Let's go over to the mobile. Mobile is pretty much the exact same rules. Nothing really special. It's just that the ones you should really focus more on are the eliminate render blocking JavaScript and CSS. Again, render blocking CSS, not a real performance issue. It's just a rendering issue. The main thing is you want to get your content in front of the users as fast as humanly possible. That way, they'll be able to explore your website. That's why having JavaScript in the header, while may not really be truly slowing it down, it slows the painting time because it's still having to grab all the JavaScript before it can actually paint the things that it wants to animate. Think about it this way: if you load the JavaScript before CSS, which is a performance issue at the end of itself, you're trying to animate the object that's not painted yet. While it works because it's going to say, okay, you want this to be painted, and the jQuery was already loaded for it. That's great. But you still have to wait for the CSS to be done in order to paint the object in the first place. That's just common sense. It's like trying to create a movie without having any of the characters and models done, but you got the animations worked out. I mean, it just doesn't work. You can't create a movie like that. It's best to have all the characters and everything drawn, and then to animate them, or to then create animations for them that you can apply to them. But the other issues with CSS is there's a ton of CSS. Frankly, I've been seeing huge themes, including buttloads of CSS. Not a bad thing, because it means the sites actually look decent. The bad thing is this WordPress sucks in this department because there's no reasonable way to actually get it to function. WordPress does not work well with... The problem is, as a theme developer, here's what you have to look at. You're either going to have to assume that users are going to compress their sites and optimize them properly, or that they're not. 9 times out of 10, users will not do anything to optimize their website because they figured that the theme that they got a Theme Forest or a Mojo Marketplace is already optimized for them. That's not always the case. Actually, in most cases, that's not the case. So what happens is they try to do tricks or workarounds by inlining CSS, such as inlining WooCommerce and BBPress CSS. Sometimes it's minor little fixes just so it works with the theme, which is fine. However, then you're loading that extra CSS on every single page, even if it's not necessarily needed. That's right there is a performance issue. But for the users who are just purchasing the theme expecting it to work, which is the target market of theme providers, then it's perfect. In fact, if you were to go through and try to educate every single purchaser of a theme, they'll realize these themes are not optimized properly. For instance, on newspaper, the default CSS before compression weighs in at about almost 1 megabyte. 1 meg of CSS is a tremendously huge file. That is so beyond what the norm was. That's bigger than most of the websites were back in like 2004. And the reason is because they don't optimize it properly. I'm going to show you again another tool, and it's the inspect element, and then you go to Chrome, and then you do an audit. And you're going to see how stupid this stuff really comes down to be. Remove unused CSS rules. Look at all the sheer amount of CSS that's in this on the page, but is not used. 100% of this file, all my WooCommerce junk, is not needed, but it's still loaded. 100% of this file for BBPress is what it's looking like, is not needed. BBPress, BuddyPress is not needed on this page, but it's still loading. 100%. These are two files that are being loaded that absolutely have zero purpose. But the problem is theme authors try to include them everywhere. Look at this. Contact Form 7. More WooCommerce. All being loaded on this page for stuff that is not even needed. It's not needed. They're poorly optimized. And the best thing you can do after you get it is you can either try and rewrite the theme and then miss out on any potential updates, which we don't want to do, and neither would I. So then what you have to do is you have to try and conditionally load all this CSS, which you'll spend the next couple hours crying as you try to get it done properly. Because you have to rewrite the function. You have to go in and you have to dequeue the CSS, and then you have to tell it what pages to load on. Then you have to figure out all them. Not to mention, because WordPress is really stupid with the way it handles it, you have to get all the handlers for the CSS, then you can load them on the corresponding pages. And if you use something like BuddyPress, then the chances are is you'll never figure out what the page or the shortcode or anything to identify the page that it's supposed to be loaded on, because it's a pain. BuddyPress, 9 times out of 10, I just leave it. I just leave all the JavaScript files and CSS because it loads such a sheer amount and I can't figure out a decent way to get them to load properly, then I just leave it and try to combine them. In most cases that's fine, but I don't see the point of me loading all that. Like on here, I'm trying to get it done to where all the BuddyPress stuff is only loaded on the BuddyPress pages, and then I want to do it with all the other theme files. Like I've managed to get the WooCommerce and the contact form and some of the other CSS only loading on their corresponding pages. That's great. This thing has like a load time of less than 1 second. I would think I'm at like 0.7 seconds for this homepage, but I'm still not where I want. And I want to redesign it and fix things. And that's perfect. The main thing is page speed is right, but following it all the time will cause you to blow your brains out. Page Speed Insights is a wonderful tool because it tells you everything that you're doing wrong in the first place, but at the same time, that's what drives you crazy. You'll realize that you've done a lot of things wrongly, and a lot of theme developers do things wrong, which is bad. I'm going to show you a theme that I worked on, and it was the My Arcade theme for My Arcade plugin. I'm going to show you what is loaded on this page. There's no plugins really running on this site, which is not how it normally would be. But we did things in a semi-intelligent way. I have a lot of there's a ton of CSS files, really. I mean, you could technically combine all these. Our handler for the script CSS is the same as it was for fun games. Yeah, I'll fix that later. But we have not that many CSS files, and there's a ton going on in this page. There's quite a few JavaScript files though. And if we run an audit, you'll see that a lot of the CSS is probably used. There's none overload. See, only 1,000 as compared to the 7,000 CSS rules that was on my page. Some things like the page Navi CSS is not used. Post ratings. But if you see, they're very, very small amounts of CSS. So it's not large chunks. Score presenter, very little CSS. Very little CSS. This needs to stay in. There's no real way to get around fixing that. Style.css. Yeah, 64%. We're not using 100% of all the CSS files are not being used. So my recommendation is if you are a WordPress developer, a site owner, or a theme developer, follow the page speed insights rules the best you can. But the best thing you can always do is go back to GT matrix and say, how fast is it loading? What's your page size? And how many requests do you have? The main thing to do, shoot for high scores on GT matrix. That is about how these are the rules that truly matter for how fast your website's going to load, except for like minor things like remove query strings. Another good one is webpagetest.org and Pingdom. Webpagetest.org and Pingdom tools. Let's just see. Sometimes Pingdom's been a pain lately, but let's see if this works. Like, it'll time out and do weird things. 96% faster. Boom. That is a good score. Web page test, it'll probably do something a little bit on the higher end. I don't know why web page test is always slower, but who cares? And they give you nice little cool things here, but maybe. I don't want that. Look at all those. Look at all those 0 bytes. That's perfect. Admin.ajax. I hate admin.ajax. It's so pathetically annoying. Oh, I know why now. I just had like an epiphany right there of the issue with that load time with admin.ajax. And boom, it says, apparently on the expensive side, the first load time was 1.75 seconds. Typically, the best load times I always follow are Pingdom. Pingdom, I always get the most accurate load time. Web page test, I get some of the more important things. I get more analytic views, like the first view and the repeat view. This is useful for seeing the content that's being loaded afterwards. So this is the first view of the web page. This is the second view. So it shows you how much is actually being cached and if it's being cached properly. See? Fully loaded 50 requests from 40 requests. Document complete is right there. Cache static content. It says that a lot of this stuff, advertisements cannot be cached or managed by you, so you can't really do anything. Use a CDN. I can't do anything for the Amazon one. Compress images. I could probably compress these images a little bit more. Use gzip. Can't do that for WAF files. All in all, it's very useful. It also tells you things that are not necessarily loading at all, or things are not being cached. So it's a very, 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 very good tool. I recommend if you're looking for something that has a good content breakdown, performance overview, then you use web page test. If you're looking to get the most optimal like load time of your website, then use Pingdom. Like if we were to run like CNET through web page test, it would score very, very low. But on Pingdom, it'll load very, very fast because they have servers that would just put everybody else's to shame. So there you go. Thank you very much for watching. Please stay tuned for the next video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, put them below and I'll make sure to help you out. Thank you very much for watching and goodbye.